What would you do if you found yourself alone in enemy territory, wounded, with no supplies, and everyone believing you were dead? Most people would give up. Most people would wait for rescue that might never come. But this is not the story of most people. This is the story of a woman who refused to accept death, who turned her back on despair, and who walked through hell itself to find her way home. When the odds were stacked impossibly against her, when every logical voice would have told her to surrender, she chose to fight. She chose to live. And, in doing so, she proved that the human spirit is capable of miracles that defy all understanding. Sarah had volunteered for this dangerous assignment despite having a comfortable position at a London hospital, driven by an unshakable belief that her skills were needed most where the danger was greatest. Sarah came from humble beginnings in a small village outside Manchester. Her father had been a country doctor who taught her that healing was not just a profession, but a calling. When the war began, she watched as young men from her village marched off to fight, many never to return. The weight of their sacrifice pressed upon her heart, and she knew she could not sit safely in England while others suffered and died for freedom. The field hospital where Sarah worked was hidden in the forests near Lyon, operating under the protection of the French resistance. It was a dangerous location, constantly under threat of discovery by German patrols, but it provided crucial medical support to both Allied operatives and resistance fighters operating behind enemy lines. Sarah had proven herself invaluable not only for her medical expertise, but also for her calm demeanor under pressure and her ability to communicate in French, a skill that had saved countless lives. On this particular morning, Sarah was attending to a young resistance fighter who had been brought in during the night with severe gunshot wounds. His name was Jean-Pierre, barely 19 years old, with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. As she worked to clean his wounds and prepare him for surgery, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Nurse," he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible above the constant background noise of the hospital. "The Germans, they know about us. My contact in the village, he was captured. They made him talk." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had seen what happened when the Germans discovered resistance operations. The brutal efficiency with which they eliminated any threat to their occupation was legendary. She looked around the tent, suddenly, seeing everything differently. The 23 patients currently under their care, the medical supplies they had worked so hard to acquire, the staff who had become like family to her over the past months, all of it was now in mortal danger. She immediately sought out Dr. Robert Hartley, the lead surgeon and commanding officer of their small unit. Hartley was a seasoned military doctor who had served in the First World War and had seen more than a share of impossible situations. When Sarah relayed Jean-Pierre's warning, his weathered face grew grim. "How reliable is this information?" he asked, though they both knew that in their situation, they couldn't afford to dismiss any warning, no matter how uncertain. "Jean-Pierre has never given us false intelligence before," Sarah replied. "His network has been our lifeline for supplies and information. If he says we're compromised, I believe him." Dr. Hartley nodded slowly, then began issuing rapid orders to the other staff members. "Begin evacuation procedures immediately. Priority patients first. We have maybe 2 hours if we're lucky." What followed was controlled chaos. The staff worked with practiced efficiency to stabilize patients for transport and pack essential medical supplies. The French resistance members who had been protecting them melted away into the forest, taking different routes to predetermined safe houses. Sarah found herself coordinating the evacuation of the most critical patients, her medical training allowing her to make split-second decisions about who could be moved and who needed immediate surgery before transport. As the evacuation proceeded, Sarah noticed that Jean-Pierre had fallen unconscious. His condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she knew that moving him in his current state would likely kill him. She made the difficult decision to remain behind with him, along with Dr. Hartley and 2 other nurses, to perform emergency surgery while the rest of the unit evacuated with the patients who could be safely transported. The surgery took longer than expected. Jean-Pierre's injuries were more severe than initially assessed, and they had to work with limited supplies and the constant pressure of time running out. As Sarah assisted Dr. Hartley, her hands steady despite the circumstances, she could hear the distant sound of vehicles approaching through the forest. "That's not good," muttered Corporal Davies, one of the few soldiers who had remained to help with the evacuation. He was positioned near the tent entrance, keeping watch while the medical team worked. "Those are German engines." Distinctive sound. Dr. Hartley continued working, his hands never pausing despite the approaching danger. "How much time do we need?" he asked Sarah, who was monitoring Jean-Pierre's vital signs. At least another 30 minutes to close and stabilize, she replied, though she knew they probably didn't have that long. The sound of vehicles grew closer, accompanied by the harsh barking of German commands and the baying of search dogs. Sarah's heart pounded, but her training kept her focused on the immediate task of saving Jean-Pierre's life. She had seen too many people die to let fear compromise her ability to help this young man who had risked everything to warn them. Sarah, Dr. Hartley said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made her look up from her work. If they find us, you need to run. Your knowledge of the local language and terrain gives you the best chance of escape. The resistance needs people like you. She wanted to protest, to insist that they would all escape together. But the approaching sounds of the German search party made it clear that this was no longer a realistic hope. The vehicles had stopped nearby, and she could hear soldiers dismounting and organizing search teams. The dogs were getting closer, their excited barking indicating they had picked up human scents. There, Dr. Hartley said, completing the final sutures on Jean-Pierre. He'll live if he gets proper care in the next few hours. Davies, help me get him ready for transport. But even as they prepared to move Jean-Pierre, the tent flap burst open and German soldiers poured in, their weapons raised and voices shouting commands in harsh, clipped German. Sarah instinctively raised her hands, her mind racing as she calculated distances and escape routes. But she knew it was hopeless. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and in an enclosed space with wounded patients who couldn't be abandoned. The German officer who entered after the initial soldiers was a tall, stern man with cold blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the makeshift hospital in a single glance. His uniform was immaculate despite the forest setting, and the Iron Cross at his throat marked him as a veteran of many campaigns. He spoke in fluent English, his accent thick, but his words precise. You will surrender all weapons and medical supplies. Any resistance will be met with immediate execution. His gaze settled on Jean-Pierre, still unconscious on the operating table. This one is a known terrorist. He will come with us. Dr. Hartley stepped forward, his medical ethics overriding his sense of self-preservation. This man is under medical care and cannot be moved safely. As a doctor, I cannot allow. The sharp crack of the German officer's pistol echoed through the tent. Dr. Hartley collapsed, a look of surprise rather than pain on his face as blood spread across his chest. Sarah screamed and rushed to his side, her medical training automatically taking over as she tried to stem the bleeding. But she could see in his eyes that it was too late. That was an example, the officer said coldly. The next person to speak without permission will receive the same treatment. You will gather all medical records and intelligence materials. You have 5 minutes. Sarah knelt beside Dr. Hartley, holding his hand as his life ebbed away. The man who had taught her so much about military medicine, who had become a mentor and friend, was dying because he had tried to protect a patient. The injustice of it filled her with a rage that threatened to overwhelm her grief. But she knew that showing any emotion now would likely result in her own death. The German soldiers quickly and efficiently gathered all documents, medical supplies, and anything else that might be of value or intelligence importance. Jean-Pierre was loaded onto a stretcher despite his critical condition, his unconscious form a reminder of the warning that had ultimately been too late to save them. Sarah and the 2 other nurses were bound with rope and forced to march deeper into the forest, away from the hospital site that had been their home and sanctuary for 6 months. Behind them, she could smell smoke as the Germans burned the tents and any remaining supplies that might aid future resistance operations. As they walked, Sarah tried to process what had happened and what might happen next. She knew enough about German treatment of captured Allied personnel to understand that their situation was desperate. Medical personnel were sometimes treated according to Geneva Convention protocols, but they had been found in an illegal field hospital supporting resistance operations. This placed them in a gray area that often resulted in summary execution rather than prisoner of war status. The march continued for several hours through increasingly dense forest terrain. Sarah's feet began to blister in her worn medical shoes, not designed for long-distance hiking over rough ground. The ropes around her wrists chafed with each step, and the weight of her grief over Dr. Hartley's death seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical burden. As the afternoon wore on, the German patrol stopped at what appeared to be a temporary encampment. There were several other prisoners already there, mostly French civilians who had been accused of supporting the resistance. Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, the resigned acceptance of people who had seen too much of war's cruelty. The German officer who had shot Dr. Hartley began questioning the prisoners one by one. His methods were efficient and brutal, using both physical violence and psychological pressure to extract information about resistance networks, safe houses, and Allied operations. Sarah watched in horror as people she had treated and worked alongside were beaten for information they either didn't have or refused to give. When her turn came, the officer's questions focused on the field hospital's intelligence connections and her knowledge of resistance operations. Sarah answered truthfully that she was medical personnel and had limited knowledge of operational details, but she could see that her responses were not satisfying her interrogator. "You speak French too well for a simple nurse," he observed, his cold eyes studying her face for signs of deception. "You have been operating behind our lines for months. You must have intelligence value." Sarah maintained her composure, drawing on the training she had received before being deployed to occupied France. "I learned French in school and college. It helped me communicate with patients and local medical contacts, nothing more." The interrogation continued for what felt like hours, though the gathering darkness made it difficult to judge the passage of time. Sarah's body ached from maintaining stress positions, and her throat was dry from repeated questioning, but she held to her story. She was helped by the fact that her role had indeed been primarily medical, and she genuinely didn't have detailed knowledge of resistance operational security. As night fell, the prisoners were crowded into a makeshift holding area created by stringing barbed wire between trees. They huddled together for warmth and mutual support, sharing whispered words of comfort and what little information they had about their captors' intentions. Sarah found herself next to an elderly French farmer named Henri who had been captured for allegedly providing food to resistance fighters. Despite his own desperate situation, he showed concern for her well-being, offering her his jacket when he noticed her shivering in the cold night air. "You must stay strong," he whispered in French, his words barely audible above the wind in the trees. "Tomorrow they will decide our fates. Some of us may not see another sunset, but you are young, you have skills they might need. There may be hope for you yet." Sarah wanted to believe his optimistic words, but she had seen enough of German efficiency to know that prisoners who couldn't provide useful intelligence often became liabilities to be eliminated. She spent the long, cold night thinking about her family back in England, about the patients she had treated and lost, and about Dr. Hartley's final act of courage in trying to protect Jean-Pierre. As dawn broke through the forest canopy, Sarah could hear increased activity in the German camp. Vehicles were arriving, and there seemed to be preparation for movement. She watched through the wire as officers consulted maps and issued orders to their subordinates. The other prisoners had fallen into the exhausted silence of people who had accepted their fate, but Sarah felt a growing determination not to give up without a fight. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. As the Germans began organizing the prisoners for transport, one of the guards dropped his keys while unlocking the wire gate. In the confusion of getting 20-some prisoners organized and counted, Sarah managed to palm the keys without being noticed. She knew it was a desperate chance, but it was the only chance she was likely to get. The transport convoy began moving deeper into German-controlled territory, with prisoners loaded into the back of military trucks under heavy guard. Sarah worked carefully and quietly to unlock her restraints while maintaining the appearance of being securely bound. The rough roads and noise of the convoy provided cover for her movements, and the guards' attention was focused on watching for potential rescue attempts from outside rather than escape attempts from within. When the convoy stopped for a brief rest and refueling, Sarah made her move. As guards began taking prisoners off the trucks for a supervised bathroom break, she slipped away from the group and disappeared into the dense underbrush that lined the forest road. She heard shouts and commotion behind her as her absence was discovered, but she was already running through the trees, driven by adrenaline and the knowledge that capture now would certainly mean immediate execution. Behind her, she could hear dogs barking and soldiers crashing through the forest in pursuit. But Sarah had one advantage they didn't expect. Her months of living and working in these forests had given her an intimate knowledge of the terrain. She knew which paths would be difficult for vehicles to follow, which streams would mask her scent from the dogs, and which areas provided the best concealment. For the first time since her capture, Sarah felt a spark of hope. She was free, she was alive, and she was going to find a way home. But as the reality of her situation began to sink in, She realized that her escape was just the beginning of what would become the most challenging experience of her life. She was alone in enemy territory, with no supplies, no weapons, no way to contact allies, and hundreds of miles of hostile territory between her and safety. The forest around her suddenly seemed vast and threatening. Every sound could be a German patrol. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier. But Sarah Mitchell, the country doctor's daughter who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment she could find, was not ready to give up. She was going to survive, and she was going to make it home, no matter what it took. The first hours of freedom felt like both a gift and a curse. Sarah ran through the dense French forest until her lungs burned and her legs trembled with exhaustion. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but she knew the Germans wouldn't give up easily. An escaped prisoner with potential intelligence value would be worth significant resources to recapture, and they had dogs that could track her scent for miles. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, hidden deep in a thicket of brambles that tore at her medical uniform, Sarah took stock of her situation. She had managed to escape with nothing but the clothes on her back, a thin medical coat over her uniform blouse and skirt, worn leather shoes that were already developing holes, and no food, water, or supplies of any kind. The late September weather was growing cold, especially at night, and she was hundreds of miles from any Allied territory. But, perhaps most challenging of all, she had no way to distinguish friend from foe among the local population. While many French civilians supported the resistance, just as many were either neutral or actively collaborated with the German occupation. One wrong choice about who to trust could mean capture, torture, and death. Sarah forced herself to think systematically about her priorities. Water was most critical. She could survive weeks without food, but only days without water. Shelter would become crucial as the weather grew colder, and she needed to find a way to navigate toward Allied territory without being caught by German patrols or betrayed by collaborators. The forest provided some immediate solutions. She found a small stream about a half-mile from where she had stopped, clear mountain water that tasted better than anything she remembered from her comfortable life in England. Using her medical knowledge, she was careful to drink slowly and avoid consuming too much too quickly after the stress and exertion of her escape. For shelter, Sarah remembered survival techniques her father had taught her during childhood camping trips in the Lake District. Using fallen branches and her medical coat, she constructed a small lean-to shelter hidden deep in a grove of pine trees. It wouldn't keep her warm, but it would provide some protection from wind and rain, and, more importantly, it would be nearly invisible to anyone passing by. Food was more problematic. Sarah had some knowledge of edible plants from her medical training, but she was in unfamiliar territory and couldn't risk making mistakes that might poison her or make her too sick to continue. She found some blackberries still hanging on bushes despite the late season, and some nuts that had fallen from trees, but she knew these meager calories wouldn't sustain her for long. As the first night of freedom fell, Sarah huddled in her makeshift shelter, every sense alert for signs of danger. The forest at night was full of sounds: wind in the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. But any of these sounds could mask the approach of German patrols, and she knew they would be searching systematically through the area where she had escaped. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals. Sarah would doze for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes before jolting awake at some real or imagined sound, her heart racing as she strained to determine whether she was still alone and safe. By dawn, she felt more exhausted than when she had stopped running, but she knew she couldn't afford to rest during daylight hours. The second day brought new challenges. Sarah's stomach cramped with hunger, and her body was already beginning to show the effects of inadequate nutrition. More concerning was the pain developing in her left ankle, which she had twisted during her frantic escape through the forest. Each step sent sharp pains up her leg, and she could feel the ankle swelling despite her attempts to bind it with strips torn from her uniform. But she pushed forward, using the sun to maintain a general southwesterly direction that she hoped would eventually lead toward Allied territory. Her pace was painfully slow as she tried to balance the need for speed with the requirement to remain hidden from German patrols that she knew were still searching for her. That afternoon, Sarah faced her first major decision point. The forest ended at the edge of a small French village, and she could see that the main road continued south through the town center. Going around the village would add miles to her journey and take her through more exposed terrain, but Going through the town meant risking contact with people who might betray her location. From her hiding place at the forest edge, Sarah observed the village for over an hour. It appeared to be a typical rural French community, with perhaps 50 houses clustered around a small church and market square. She could see people going about their daily business, women hanging laundry, children playing in the streets, men working in gardens. But she also noticed something that made her blood run cold: a German military vehicle parked near the church, and uniformed soldiers questioning residents. The presence of German troops meant the village was either under occupation or being searched as part of the effort to recapture her. Either way, entering the town would be suicide. But as Sarah prepared to take the longer route around the village, she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two German soldiers were talking near their vehicle, their voices carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. Sarah's knowledge of German, gained during her medical training and enhanced by months of treating prisoners and captured documents, allowed her to understand their discussion. "The search is being called off," one soldier was saying. "Command believes she died in the forest. 3 days with no food or shelter, and her tracks disappeared at the river. They want us to return to base." "Good," replied the second soldier. "Waste of time chasing one nurse through the woods. We have more important work to do." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with bitter satisfaction. The Germans believed she was dead, which meant they would stop actively searching for her. But their assessment of her chances wasn't entirely wrong. 3 days with almost no food and inadequate shelter was pushing her body to its limits. She needed to find help soon, or their prediction might become reality. As the German vehicle drove away, Sarah made a calculated decision to approach the village. With the immediate search called off, the risk of walking into a German patrol had decreased, and her desperate need for food and medical supplies outweighed the danger of potential betrayal by villagers. She waited until evening, then approached one of the houses on the outskirts of the village. It was a modest stone cottage with a small garden, and she had observed an elderly woman living there alone. Sarah's reasoning was that an older person might be more sympathetic to her plight and less likely to be actively collaborating with the Germans. When she knocked softly on the cottage door, her heart was pounding so hard she was sure it would give her away. The door opened cautiously, revealing a weathered woman in her 70s with kind but cautious eyes. Sarah spoke in French, keeping her voice low and respectful. "Madam, I am lost and injured. I need help." The woman's eyes took in Sarah's torn clothing, her obvious exhaustion, and the way she favored her injured ankle. For a long moment, they stared at each other, and Sarah realized that her fate hung in the balance of this stranger's decision. The woman could help her, turn her away, or betray her to the Germans. "You are the one they were searching for," the woman said finally. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, too exhausted and desperate to attempt further deception. "Yes, but I am not a spy or a terrorist. I am a nurse. I was helping wounded people." The woman studied her for another long moment, then stepped aside to let Sarah enter. "I am Marie Dubois. My son died fighting the Germans in 1940. My grandson joined the resistance and was executed last year." She closed the door behind Sarah and drew the curtains. "You may stay tonight, but you cannot remain here long. The Germans will return, and my neighbors cannot all be trusted." Marie's cottage was a haven beyond Sarah's wildest hopes. There was hot soup made from vegetables and rabbit, bread that tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten, and, most precious of all, a chance to wash and tend to her injuries properly. Marie provided her with clean clothes, simple peasant garments that would help her blend in with the rural population, and basic medical supplies to treat her sprained ankle and the various cuts and scratches she had accumulated during her escape. But perhaps most valuable was the intelligence Marie shared about the local situation. She explained which roads were regularly patrolled by German troops, which villages were known to harbor collaborators, and which route offered the best chance of reaching Allied territory without detection. "You must go west toward the coast," Marie explained, spreading a hand-drawn map on her kitchen table. "The resistance operates a network there that helps Allied personnel escape across the channel. But it is more than 200 kilometers, and the journey will take you through some of the most heavily patrolled areas in occupied France." Sarah studied the map, memorizing landmarks and safe areas that Marie had marked. The distance seemed impossible, more than 100 miles on foot, through enemy territory, with limited supplies and no support network. But she had already survived 3 days on her own, Each mile would take her closer to freedom. Marie provided Sarah with a small pack containing food for several days, a water container, basic medical supplies, and some French francs that might be useful for purchasing supplies along the way. Most importantly, she gave her papers identifying her as Claire Moreau, a farm worker traveling to visit relatives near the coast. The papers are not perfect, Marie warned. They will not survive close examination by German officials, but they should be sufficient for casual encounters with civilians or routine checks by local police. As Sarah prepared to leave the next evening, Marie offered one final piece of advice that would prove crucial in the days to come. Trust your instincts about people, she said. In times like these, you must learn to read faces and hearts quickly. Some people will help you because it is right. Others will betray you for reward or from fear. The ability to tell the difference will determine whether you live or die. Sarah left Marie's cottage with a full stomach, clean clothes, and renewed determination. But she also carried the weight of knowing that she was now truly on her own. Marie had risked her life to help a stranger, but Sarah couldn't ask anyone else to take such risks. From this point forward, she would have to rely entirely on her own resources and judgment. The next several days established a pattern that would define Sarah's journey home. She traveled mostly at night, using the darkness to conceal her movement and sleeping during daylight hours in hidden locations, abandoned buildings, dense woods, or farm structures that appeared to be unused. Her medical training helped her treat minor injuries and illnesses that might have stopped someone else, and her growing knowledge of the local terrain helped her avoid the most dangerous areas. But the constant stress was taking its toll. Sarah lost weight steadily despite her careful rationing of food. Her clothes hung loose on her diminishing frame, and her face took on the gaunt appearance of someone living on the edge of starvation. More concerning were the psychological effects of constant fear and isolation. She began talking to herself to maintain her sanity, and sometimes found herself jumping at shadows or sounds that posed no real threat. Her ankle continued to cause problems despite her attempts to treat it. What had begun as a simple sprain was developing into a more serious injury that made walking increasingly painful. She fashioned a crude walking stick from a fallen branch, but she knew that her deteriorating mobility would eventually become a critical problem. On her 7th day of freedom, Sarah faced her first real test of Marie's advice about reading people. She had been forced to detour around a German checkpoint and found herself lost in an area of small farms and scattered houses. Exhausted and running low on food, she approached a farmhouse where she had observed a middle-aged couple working in their fields. The man who answered her knock had a face that could have belonged to anyone, neither obviously friendly nor hostile, neither clearly trustworthy nor suspicious. Sarah had to make a split-second decision based on nothing more than intuition and desperation. "I am traveling to visit family," she said, showing her false papers. "I have become lost, and wondered if you could give me directions to the main road." The farmer studied her papers carefully, and Sarah's heart raced as she wondered if he would notice the subtle imperfections that Marie had warned her about. But after what seemed like an eternity, he handed them back with a slight nod. "The road is 2 kilometers west," he said. "But there was a German patrol through here this morning. They may return tonight. You should be careful." The warning could have been genuine concern or a subtle threat. Sarah thanked him and began walking in the direction he had indicated, but she noticed that his wife had disappeared into the house during their conversation. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and Marie's advice about trusting instincts echoed in her mind. Her suspicions proved justified when she spotted the same farm wife hurrying along a path that led toward the village center. Sarah immediately changed direction, abandoning the route the farmer had suggested, and striking out across country toward higher ground where she could observe the area. From a hillside overlooking the farm, she watched as German soldiers arrived within an hour of her encounter with the farmer. They surrounded the area where she would have been if she had followed the suggested route, clearly acting on information about her location and direction of travel. The near miss was a sobering reminder that her survival depended on constant vigilance and the ability to make correct life or death judgments about people she met for only a few moments. She had been fortunate this time, but she knew that one mistake would be her last. As Sarah continued her journey westward, avoiding the compromised area around the farm, she reflected on how much she had changed in just 1 week. The comfortable life of a London nurse seemed like a memory from another person's existence. She had learned to move silently through forests, to read the landscape for signs of danger, and to make decisions based on incomplete information and pure instinct. But she had also learned something more profound about herself. Despite the constant fear, the physical hardship, and the isolation, she had not broken. Each day that she survived made her stronger and more determined to complete her journey home. The woman who had escaped from that German convoy was discovering reserves of strength and courage she had never known she possessed. The landscape began to change as Sarah moved west toward the coast. The dense forest gave way to more open farmland, which provided better visibility but also made concealment more difficult. She had to adjust her travel patterns, moving in shorter spurts and spending more time carefully observing areas before crossing them. Her food supplies were running dangerously low despite careful rationing. The few edible plants she could find supplemented her meager rations, but she was losing weight steadily and could feel her strength declining with each passing day. More than once, she considered approaching another farmhouse for help, but the memory of her near betrayal kept her moving forward instead. On the 10th day of her journey, Sarah reached a milestone that filled her with both hope and trepidation. From a hilltop near the village of Saint-Étienne, she could smell salt air carried on the wind. The coast was still perhaps 40 kilometers away, but for the first time since her escape, she had tangible evidence that her destination was within reach. But reaching the coast was only part of the challenge. Marie had warned her that the coastal areas were heavily fortified and patrolled, part of Germany's Atlantic Wall defenses. Finding the resistance network that could arrange her passage to England would require her to penetrate some of the most dangerous territory in occupied France. As Sarah began her descent toward the coastal plain, she carried with her everything she had learned during 10 days of survival behind enemy lines. She had discovered that the human spirit could endure incredible hardship when driven by the will to live and return home. She had learned to trust her instincts, to read danger in faces and landscapes, and to find strength in herself that she had never known existed. But, perhaps most importantly, she had learned that survival was not just about staying alive. It was about maintaining hope, dignity, and purpose even in the face of overwhelming odds. Every step toward the coast was a victory against the forces that had tried to break her spirit. And, with each mile, Sarah Mitchell was proving that some people simply refuse to be defeated, no matter what the world throws at them. The coastal region of occupied France presented Sarah with challenges unlike anything she had encountered during her inland journey. The open farmland gave way to a landscape dominated by German military installations, concrete bunkers, and endless rolls of barbed wire that stretched along the cliffs overlooking the English Channel. Every road seemed to have checkpoints, every village crawled with patrols, and the very air seemed thick with the tension of military occupation. Sarah spent 3 days observing the German defenses from hidden positions in the coastal hills, trying to understand the patterns of patrol routes and shift changes that might offer her an opportunity to penetrate deeper into the restricted zone. What she saw was both impressive and terrifying, a defensive system so thorough and well-organized that it seemed impossible for anyone to pass through undetected. The Atlantic Wall was Hitler's greatest engineering project, a line of fortifications designed to repel any Allied invasion attempt. Massive concrete gun emplacements pointed out toward the English Channel, their artillery pieces capable of sinking any ship that dared approach the French coast. Between these major installations, smaller bunkers and machine gun nests created overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any attacking force. And behind it all, thousands of German soldiers maintained constant vigilance against both external attack and internal resistance. But Sarah was not looking for a way to attack these defenses. She was searching for a way to slip through them like water flowing around rocks. Her medical training had taught her to look for weaknesses and vulnerabilities in systems, to find the small flaws that could be exploited for healing. Now she applied that same analytical approach to the German defensive network. After careful observation, Sarah identified what appeared to be a narrow gap in the patrol patterns near a fishing village called Port-en-Bessin. The village sat in a small harbor protected by high cliffs, and the German patrols seemed to focus their attention on the main approaches rather than the treacherous paths that local fishermen used to reach their boats. If she could reach the village during a shift change, she might be able to make contact with locals who could help her find the resistance network Marie had told her about. But first, she needed to deal with her deteriorating physical condition. 2 weeks of survival on minimal food and constant stress had pushed her body to its limits. Her clothes hung on her like sacks, her face was gaunt with exhaustion, and Her injured ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Most concerning of all, she had developed a persistent cough that she recognized as the early stages of pneumonia, brought on by exposure to cold and dampness during her nights sleeping outdoors. Sarah knew that her medical condition was becoming as dangerous as the German patrols. Pneumonia could kill her as surely as a bullet, and her weakened state was making it increasingly difficult to think clearly and make good decisions. She needed shelter, proper food, and medical care, but obtaining these necessities would require her to take enormous risks. On the night of October 1st, Sarah made her approach toward Port-in-Bessin. She had waited for a night with heavy cloud cover that would provide maximum concealment, and she had timed her movement to coincide with what she had observed to be a gap in the German patrol schedule. Moving as quietly as possible despite her injured ankle, she worked her way down the cliff paths that led toward the harbor. The village was larger than it had appeared from her distant observation point. Perhaps 200 houses clustered around a small harbor where fishing boats bobbed at their moorings despite the wartime restrictions on maritime activity. German soldiers were billeted in several of the larger buildings, and Sarah could see sentries posted at key points around the harbor perimeter. But there were also signs of normal village life continuing despite the occupation. Lights showed in windows where families gathered for their evening meals, and she could smell bread baking in one of the local bakeries. The normalcy was both comforting and strange after 2 weeks of living like a hunted animal in the wilderness. Sarah's target was a small church that sat on a hill overlooking the harbor. Marie had told her that churches often served as communication points for resistance networks, and she hoped that the local priest might be able to connect her with people who could arrange her passage to England. It was a desperate gamble, but she was running out of both time and options. The Church of St. Pierre was ancient even by French standards, its stone walls weathered by centuries of coastal storms. Sarah approached it carefully, watching for any signs of German surveillance or local informants who might report her presence to the occupying forces. The heavy wooden doors were unlocked, and she slipped inside during a moment when the nearby German sentry was facing away from the building. Inside, the church was dark except for candles flickering before a statue of the Virgin Mary. The familiar smell of incense and old wood brought back childhood memories of attending services with her parents in their village church back in England. For a moment, the weight of homesickness was almost overwhelming, and Sarah had to fight back tears as she thought about everything she had lost and how far she still had to go. She was not alone in the church. An elderly priest knelt in prayer before the altar, his white hair gleaming in the candlelight. Sarah approached him cautiously, unsure whether he could be trusted, but knowing she had little choice. When she whispered a soft greeting in French, the priest looked up with eyes that seemed to take in her desperate condition immediately. "My child, you are in great danger," Father Antoine said quietly. "The Germans search every building in the village twice each night. You cannot remain here." Sarah explained her situation as briefly as possible, watching the priest's face for any sign of whether he might be willing to help her or planning to turn her in to the German authorities. Father Antoine listened without comment, his weathered hands clasped before him, as if he were continuing his interrupted prayers. When she finished speaking, the priest was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "There are people who might help you, but the risks are enormous for everyone involved. The Germans have infiltrated several resistance networks, and we have lost good people to betrayal. Why should we trust you?" It was a fair question, and Sarah realized she had no good answer. She was asking these people to risk their lives for a stranger who could easily be a German agent sent to expose their operations. All she could offer was her desperate honesty and the hope that this priest could see something in her face that marked her as genuine. "Because I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. "Because I am dying slowly out there in the cold, and because I believe that good people will help when they can, even when it's dangerous." Father Antoine studied her face for what seemed like an eternity. Then, he stood slowly, his old joints creaking with the effort. "Follow me," he said. "But if we are caught, you must promise to say that you forced me to help you at gunpoint. I will not have my congregation suffer for my decisions." The priest led her through a hidden door behind the altar that Sarah would never have noticed on her own. Beyond the door, narrow stone steps descended into what appeared to be ancient catacombs beneath the church. The passages were barely wide enough for one person, carved directly from the rock on which the church had been built centuries ago. "These tunnels connect to several buildings in the village," Father Antoine explained as they made their way through the underground maze. They were built to hide villagers from Viking raids 1,000 years ago. Now they serve a similar purpose against different invaders. The tunnels led to the basement of what appeared to be an ordinary fisherman's cottage on the edge of the village. When they emerged through a concealed entrance behind a pile of fishing nets, Sarah found herself face to face with a woman about her own age who had clearly been expecting their arrival. "This is Margot," Father Antoine said. "She will decide whether to help you further. I have done all I can." Margot was a striking woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess Sarah's condition and potential value in a matter of seconds. She was clearly a person accustomed to making life and death decisions quickly, and Sarah could sense the strength and determination that had kept her alive in one of the most dangerous occupations in occupied Europe. "You look terrible," Margot said bluntly. "Half dead from exhaustion and malnutrition, injured, probably sick. Why should we risk our network for someone who might not survive another week anyway?" The harsh assessment stung, but Sarah realized it was probably accurate. She was indeed on the edge of physical collapse, and her medical training told her that pneumonia was beginning to settle into her lungs. But she had not come this far to give up now. "Because I'm still alive when I should be dead," Sarah replied. "Because I've made it 200 kilometers through enemy territory with nothing but determination. Because if I can survive this, I can survive anything, and that makes me valuable to your cause." Margot smiled slightly at the response, apparently approving of Sarah's refusal to present herself as a helpless victim. "Fair enough. But understand that we are not running a charity operation here. We help Allied personnel escape because they provide intelligence value and can return to fight against the Germans." "What intelligence do you have?" Sarah had been dreading this question because she realized that her intelligence value was minimal. She had been captured before the resistance evacuation could provide her with sensitive operational details, and her medical role had kept her isolated from most strategic planning. But she tried to offer what little she could. She provided details about German interrogation techniques, troop movements she had observed during her captivity and escape, and information about the field hospital network that might be useful for planning future medical support operations. It wasn't much, but Margot listened carefully and asked intelligent follow-up questions that suggested she was evaluating more than just the information content. "Your medical skills could be valuable to our operations," Margot said finally. "We lose people regularly to infections and injuries that proper medical care could prevent. And you've demonstrated that you can survive behind enemy lines, which suggests you might be useful for other missions if you make it back to England." Sarah felt a surge of hope, but Margot's next words brought her back to earth quickly. "However, arranging your extraction will require us to use resources that could help other people, and there's no guarantee of success. The Germans have been systematically hunting down our coastal networks, and we've lost 2 boats in the past month trying to run people across the channel." The discussion was interrupted by a soft knock on the cottage door, a specific pattern that Margot clearly recognized. She motioned for Sarah to hide behind a curtained alcove while she answered the door. Sarah could hear whispered conversation in rapid French, but the words were too quiet and quick for her to follow completely. When Margot returned, her expression was grim. "German patrol, heading this way. They're conducting a house-to-house search for someone. Probably you, though they might not know specifically who they're looking for. You need to hide, now." Margot led Sarah to what appeared to be a simple wooden storage chest in the corner of the room. But when she opened it, Sarah could see that it had been modified with a false bottom that created a hiding space just large enough for one person to lie flat. It was claustrophobic and uncomfortable, but it was ingeniously designed to be undetectable even during a thorough search. "No matter what you hear, do not move or make any sound," Margot warned. "If they find you, we're all dead." Sarah squeezed into the cramped hiding space, and Margot arranged fishing gear and household items in the chest above her. The false bottom was so well constructed that even from inside, Sarah couldn't detect any obvious signs that the space existed. But the psychological stress of being trapped in such a small space while knowing that German soldiers were approaching was almost overwhelming. She could hear voices outside the cottage, growing louder as the patrol approached. Then came the sharp knock on the door and harsh German commands demanding entry. Sarah forced herself to breathe slowly and quietly, fighting against the panic that threatened to make her gasp for air or shift position involuntarily. The search seemed to last forever. Sarah could hear German soldiers moving through the cottage, opening cupboards, overturning furniture, and asking Margot sharp questions about her activities and anyone she might have seen in the area. At one point, she heard footsteps approaching the chest where she was hidden, and someone began moving the items stored above her hiding place. "What is in here?" a German voice demanded. "Fishing supplies," Margot replied calmly. "Nets, tackle, bait containers. You can see for yourself." Sarah felt someone prodding the false bottom where she lay, testing its stability. For a terrifying moment, she thought the hiding place had been discovered. But the construction was too good, and the searcher apparently found nothing suspicious about a storage chest containing exactly what it appeared to contain. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, the German patrol moved on to search the next house. Sarah remained hidden for another hour before Margot finally opened the chest and helped her climb out. Her legs were cramped from being motionless in the confined space, and her injured ankle had stiffened to the point where she could barely put weight on it. "That was too close," Margot said grimly. "They're definitely looking for someone, and they're being more thorough than usual. We need to get you out of the village tonight, before they come back with more men and search dogs." Sarah was simultaneously grateful for Margot's help and terrified by the implications of what she was saying. If the resistance network was going to help her escape, it meant leaving the relative safety of the hidden tunnels and underground networks that had protected her for the past few hours. It meant venturing back into the dangerous open waters of the English Channel, where German patrol boats and aircraft could spot them at any moment. But staying in Port-in-Bessin was clearly no longer an option. The German search had been too close, and Sarah's presence was putting innocent people at risk. She had to trust these strangers with her life because she had no other choice, just as they were trusting her with their lives because they believed in helping Allied personnel escape. Margot outlined the plan quickly. They would wait until the early hours of the morning when German patrols were at their lightest, then make their way to a concealed cove about 2 kilometers down the coast. A fishing boat operated by resistance members would pick them up and attempt to run them across the channel to the English coast, a journey of about 40 kilometers through some of the most heavily patrolled waters in the world. "The boat trip will take 3 to 4 hours if everything goes perfectly," Margot explained. But perfect is rare in this business. German patrol boats, aircraft, bad weather, mechanical problems, any of these could turn a routine run into a disaster. And if we're caught, the Germans don't take prisoners from boats trying to run the channel. They sink the boat and everyone on it. Sarah nodded her understanding, though the casual way Margot discussed the possibility of death was chilling. She had survived 2 weeks behind enemy lines, overcome incredible hardships, and found her way to a resistance network that could help her reach freedom. But the final leg of her journey might also be the most dangerous. As they prepared for the escape attempt, Margot provided Sarah with warmer clothes and a waterproof coat that would be essential during the channel crossing. She also gave her some basic food supplies and a small flask of brandy that she said would help combat hypothermia if they ended up in the water. "One more thing," Margot said as they prepared to leave the cottage. "If something goes wrong during the crossing, if the boat is damaged or were spotted by German patrols, you must be prepared to go into the water and swim. The English coast is visible from mid-channel on a clear night. It looks impossible, but people have made it. Your medical training might keep you alive long enough to reach shore if you have the will to keep fighting." The thought of trying to swim 40 kilometers in the frigid waters of the English Channel seemed like madness, but Sarah realized that Margot was telling her this because people had actually survived such ordeals. The resistance leader was giving her information that might save her life in the worst-case scenario, and that gift of knowledge was both terrifying and oddly comforting. As they made their way through the darkened village toward the coastal rendezvous point, Sarah reflected on how much her perspective on survival had changed since her escape from the German convoy. 2 weeks ago, the idea of swimming across the English Channel would have seemed impossible, the stuff of adventure stories rather than reality. Now it seemed like just one more challenge to overcome, one more test of her determination to make it home alive. The resistance network in Port-in-Bessin represented hope, but it also represented the final gamble of her journey. Everything she had endured, every risk she had taken, every moment of pain and fear and determination had led to this point. In a few hours, she would either be on English soil, finally, safe, or she would be dead in the cold waters of the Channel. The journey to the hidden cove required Sarah and Margot to traverse some of the most dangerous terrain in occupied France. They moved along cliff paths barely wide enough for one person, staying low to avoid silhouettes that might be spotted by German sentries positioned at regular intervals along the coast. The Atlantic Wall's defenses were most concentrated here, where the channel was narrowest and an Allied invasion most likely. Every few hundred meters, they had to stop and wait for searchlights to sweep past their location. The German coastal defenses included powerful illumination systems designed to detect any unauthorized movement along the shoreline, and being caught in one of these lights would mean instant detection and death. Sarah's heart pounded each time the brilliant beams passed near their hiding spots, knowing that discovery now would not only mean her own death, but also the destruction of a resistance network that had helped countless Allied personnel escape to safety. The physical challenge of the cliff walk pushed Sarah to her absolute limits. Her injured ankle, which had been manageable during her overland journey, became a source of constant agony on the uneven rock surfaces. Several times she stumbled, and only Margot's quick reflexes prevented her from falling and creating noise that would have alerted German patrols to their presence. "We can rest when we're on the boat," Margot whispered during one of their brief stops. "Right now, movement is life. Every minute we delay increases the chance of discovery." The cove they were heading toward was concealed behind a natural rock formation that made it invisible from both German observation posts and naval patrols. But reaching it required them to descend a nearly vertical cliff face using a rope system that the resistance had installed for exactly this type of operation. For someone with Sarah's limited climbing experience and injured ankle, it was a terrifying prospect. Margot went first, demonstrating the technique, and then securing the rope from below while Sarah made her descent. Each movement sent sharp pains through Sarah's ankle, and her weakened condition made it difficult to maintain the grip strength necessary for a controlled descent. Halfway down the cliff face, her hands began to slip on the rope, and for a terrifying moment she thought she was going to fall onto the rocks below. But somehow she managed to complete the descent, reaching the bottom of the cove with scraped hands and renewed appreciation for how close to her physical limits she was operating. The hidden beach was only about 20 meters long, surrounded by towering cliffs that created a natural amphitheater protected from observation and most weather conditions. The boat that would attempt to carry Sarah to freedom was smaller than she had expected. A fishing vessel perhaps 10 meters long that looked barely capable of handling normal coastal waters, let alone a dangerous nighttime crossing of the English Channel. Two men were waiting with the boat, both dressed as fishermen but with the alert, watchful demeanor of people accustomed to dangerous work. "This is Paul and Henri," Margot said, introducing the boat crew. "They've made this run dozens of times and know these waters better than anyone. But they need to understand your condition before we attempt the crossing." Paul, the older of the two men, examined Sarah with the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated many desperate refugees. He checked her pulse, looked at her eyes, and asked her to walk a few steps so he could assess her mobility. His conclusion was not encouraging. "She's very weak," he told Margot. "Exhaustion, malnutrition, probably fighting an infection. If we run into rough seas or have to abandon ship, she might not survive in the water long enough for rescue." "I'll survive," Sarah interjected, her voice stronger than she felt. "I've made it this far, and I'm not giving up now. I understand the risks, and I accept them." Paul studied her face for a moment, apparently trying to assess whether her determination was genuine or simply desperate bravado. Finally, he nodded. "We leave in 10 minutes. The tide and patrol schedule give us a narrow window. Once we're committed, there's no turning back." The boat was equipped with a muffled engine designed to minimize noise that might attract German attention, but it would also make their journey slower and more vulnerable to detection by patrol vessels. The crew had painted it to look like an ordinary fishing boat, and they carried nets and other equipment to support their cover story if they were stopped and questioned. As they prepared to depart, Margot pulled Sarah aside for final instructions. "If we're spotted by German patrols, the boat will try to outrun them, but these waters are heavily patrolled, and we may not be faster than their patrol boats. If we're forced to abandon ship, stay with the boat wreckage as long as possible. It will provide some protection from the cold water. Only swim for shore as a last resort." The departure from the hidden cove was managed with military precision. Paul and Henri had timed the operation to coincide with a gap in German patrol patterns, and they moved the boat out of the cove during a period when the coastal searchlights were focused on other sections of shoreline. Sarah lay flat in the bottom of the boat, covered with fishing nets and gear, while Margot and The crew maintained their appearance as local fishermen conducting normal operations. For the first hour of the journey, everything proceeded according to plan. The sea was relatively calm, with moderate swells that made for uncomfortable but manageable conditions. The boat moved steadily away from the French coast, following a route that Paul and Henri had used successfully many times before. Sarah could feel the tension in the air beginning to ease as they put distance between themselves and the German coastal defenses. But their luck didn't hold. About halfway across the channel, Henri spotted searchlights sweeping the water ahead of them, a German patrol boat conducting a routine sweep of the shipping lanes. Paul immediately cut the engine and let the fishing boat drift, hoping they could remain undetected in the darkness between the patrol boat's sweeps. From her position hidden under the fishing nets, Sarah could hear the distant rumble of the German patrol boat's engines and see the reflection of its searchlights on the water around them. The patrol vessel was moving in a systematic search pattern, covering every section of water methodically. It was only a matter of time before the powerful lights found their small fishing boat. "If they spot us, we run for English waters," Paul whispered. "Our only chance is to get close enough to the English coast that their gunfire might be heard by British patrols. But it's going to be close." The German patrol boat continued its search pattern, the sound of its engines growing steadily louder as it approached their position. Sarah found herself holding her breath, as if the sound of breathing might somehow carry across the water and reveal their location. She could feel her heart pounding so hard that she was sure it must be visible through the fishing nets that concealed her. Then, the searchlight beam swept directly over their boat. For a moment, Sarah was sure they had been spotted, but the light passed on without stopping. The German patrol was apparently looking for larger vessels or more obvious signs of unauthorized activity. A small fishing boat drifting with its engines off appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be. But their relief was short-lived. The patrol boat began a second sweep of the same area, this time with more powerful lights and a more systematic search pattern. Paul and Henri exchanged worried glances, clearly aware that discovery during this second pass was much more likely. "Get ready to run," Paul whispered, his hand moving toward the engine controls. The German searchlight approached their position again, and this time it slowed as it reached their boat. Sarah could see the water around them illuminated as bright as daylight, and she was sure that anyone looking closely would be able to see through their disguise. The light held on their position for what seemed like an eternity, and she could hear excited voices calling out from the German patrol boat. "Now," Paul shouted, starting the engine and throwing the boat into full forward throttle. The fishing boat leaped forward with surprising speed, but the German patrol boat was already turning toward them and beginning pursuit. Sarah could hear the much more powerful engines of the military vessel growing louder as it began to close the distance between them. Margot was shouting instructions to Paul about course corrections while Henri prepared emergency equipment in case they had to abandon ship. "They're gaining on us," Henri called out, looking back toward the pursuing patrol boat. Maybe 10 minutes before they're in gun range. Sarah realized that this was exactly the situation Margot had warned her about, a pursuit that would likely end with their boat being sunk and everyone aboard killed or drowned. But, rather than panic, she felt a strange calmness settle over her. She had survived impossible odds before, and if this was how her journey ended, at least it would be while fighting for freedom rather than giving up in despair. The chase continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The German patrol boat was faster, but Paul's knowledge of local waters and currents gave them a slight advantage in choosing their route. He steered them through areas where underwater obstacles might force the pursuing vessel to be more cautious, buying precious time and distance. But, gradually, inevitably, the German boat began to close the gap. Sarah could now hear individual voices shouting commands in German, and she could see the muzzle flashes of small arms fire as the patrol boat crew began shooting at their boat. Most of the shots went wide in the darkness and rough seas, but some came close enough that she could hear bullets whistling past them. "There!" Margot shouted suddenly, pointing ahead toward a dim light on the horizon. "British patrol boat, starboard side." Paul immediately changed course toward the approaching vessel, which had apparently detected the pursuit and was moving to investigate. The German patrol boat continued firing, but their shots were becoming less accurate as the range opened up, and sea conditions made precise targeting impossible. The British patrol boat reached them just as the German vessel was getting close enough for effective gunfire. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of British voices calling out challenges and instructions over loudspeakers, and she felt a surge of emotion at hearing her own language spoken by people who represented safety and home. What followed was a tense standoff between the British and German patrol boats, with a fishing vessel caught between them. Both military vessels were heavily armed, but engaging in direct combat would represent an escalation that neither side seemed prepared to authorize without higher approval. After several minutes of circling and radio communications, the German patrol boat turned back toward the French coast, apparently deciding that pursuing one fishing boat was not worth risking an international incident. The British patrol boat crew was initially suspicious of the fishing vessel, but Margot had prepared for this eventuality with proper identification codes and contact information for British intelligence services. After some radio verification, they were cleared to continue toward the English coast under British escort. Sarah finally emerged from her hiding place under the fishing nets, and for the first time in more than 2 weeks, she could stand upright without fear of German discovery. The sight of the English coastline ahead, outlined against the dawn sky, was almost overwhelming. She had dreamed of this moment during the darkest hours of her journey, but actually seeing the cliffs of Dover approaching felt surreal. The British patrol boat escorted them to a small harbor near Deal, where immigration and intelligence officers were waiting to process their arrival. Sarah's legs were shaking as she stepped onto the dock, partly from exhaustion and physical weakness, but mostly from the emotional impact of finally reaching safety after so many days when death had seemed more likely than survival. The intelligence debriefing began immediately. Sarah was taken to a secure facility where officers from multiple agencies questioned her about everything she had seen and experienced during her time behind enemy lines. They were particularly interested in details about German defensive positions, patrol patterns, and any intelligence she might have gathered about enemy morale and effectiveness. But the questions also revealed how remarkable her journey had been, even by the standards of people accustomed to hearing survival stories. The intelligence officers seemed genuinely amazed that she had managed to travel more than 200 kilometers through occupied territory, make contact with resistance networks, and successfully escape across the channel with no formal training in escape and evasion techniques. Most people who attempt what you've done are specially trained agents with extensive preparation and support networks, one officer told her. The fact that you managed it as a medical officer with no intelligence background is almost unprecedented. Sarah's physical condition required immediate medical attention. She was severely underweight, suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition, and the pneumonia she had developed during her journey required aggressive treatment with the new antibiotic drugs that were just becoming available. But her doctors were optimistic about her recovery, and they were amazed by how well she had managed to treat her own injuries and illnesses using basic field medicine techniques. During her recovery, Sarah learned that her escape had provided valuable intelligence to Allied forces planning operations in occupied France. Her observations about German defensive positions, patrol patterns, and the effectiveness of resistance networks were incorporated into briefings for future missions. The information she provided helped save lives and contributed to the eventual success of Allied operations in the region. More personally, Sarah learned that Dr. Hartley had been posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his final act of courage in trying to protect Jean-Pierre from the German troops. Jean-Pierre himself had survived his captivity and eventually escaped to join regular Free French forces, though he would carry the scars of German interrogation for the rest of his life. The resistance network that had helped Sarah escape continued operating for several more months before being compromised by German counterintelligence operations. Margot and several others were captured and executed, but their sacrifice had enabled dozens of Allied personnel to escape and return to the fight against fascism. As Sarah recovered her strength in a British military hospital, she had time to reflect on everything she had experienced and learned during her ordeal. The comfortable, predictable world she had known before the war seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a much deeper understanding of human resilience, courage, and the capacity for both cruelty and kindness that existed in all people. She had discovered resources within herself that she had never known existed, not just physical stamina and survival skills, but psychological strength and determination that had carried her through moments when giving up would have been easier than continuing. The experience had changed her fundamentally, giving her a confidence and self-reliance that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. But, perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that survival was not just about individual strength and determination. It was about the connections between people who chose to help each other in the face of overwhelming odds. From Marie, who had risked her life to help a stranger, to the resistance fighters who had sacrificed their own safety to help Allied personnel escape, to the ordinary French civilians who had provided small acts of kindness that made survival possible. Sarah's journey had been sustained by the fundamental human capacity for compassion and solidarity. The war was far from over, and Sarah knew that her experience behind enemy lines was just one small chapter in the larger story of the fight against fascism. But she had proven, to herself and to others, that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and determination could triumph over despair and death. She had walked out of hell itself, and in doing so, had demonstrated the incredible power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle when driven by an unshakable will to survive and return home. Recovery from her ordeal took longer than Sarah had initially expected. The physical damage from 2 weeks of survival behind enemy lines was extensive: severe malnutrition, pneumonia, multiple untreated injuries, and exhaustion that went bone deep. But the psychological impact was equally significant, though it manifested in ways she hadn't anticipated. In the safety of the British military hospital, Sarah found herself struggling with nightmares, sudden panic attacks when she heard German voices, and an inability to feel truly secure even when surrounded by friendly forces. The constant vigilance that had kept her alive behind enemy lines had become so deeply ingrained that she couldn't simply turn it off now that she was safe. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the psychiatrist assigned to help returning personnel adjust to safety, explained that Sarah's reaction was completely normal. "You've spent weeks in a state of hyper-alertness where a single mistake could mean death," she said. "Your mind and body learn to operate in constant survival mode. It will take time to readjust to normal life." But even as she struggled with the psychological aftermath of her escape, Sarah was determined to return to active duty. The war was still raging, and she felt a responsibility to use her experience to help others. Her detailed knowledge of conditions behind enemy lines and her proven ability to survive in hostile territory made her valuable for training other personnel who might find themselves in similar situations. Within 6 weeks of her return, Sarah was reassigned to a special training facility where she helped develop survival and escape curricula for Allied personnel operating behind enemy lines. Her first-hand experience provided insights that no textbook could offer, and her ability to relate to students who were preparing for dangerous missions made her an effective instructor. One of her most important contributions was developing medical survival techniques that could be taught to non-medical personnel. Sarah's experience of treating her own injuries and illnesses with minimal supplies had shown her how basic medical knowledge could mean the difference between life and death for people operating without professional medical support. "The human body can survive incredible trauma and deprivation," she would tell her students. "But you have to understand its limits and work within them. Know the signs of serious infection, understand how to treat hypothermia, learn to set broken bones, and treat wounds properly. These skills are just as important as knowing how to hide from enemy patrols." Sarah also worked with intelligence services to debrief other escaped personnel and refugees who had made their way out of occupied Europe. Her experience gave her unique insight into the psychological state of people who had endured similar ordeals, and she could often help extract valuable information from traumatized individuals who were unable or unwilling to share their experiences with traditional intelligence officers. Through this work, Sarah learned that her escape had been part of a much larger pattern of resistance and survival throughout occupied Europe. Thousands of ordinary people were performing extraordinary acts of courage every day, helping Allied personnel escape, hiding Jewish families from deportation, and maintaining networks of communication and support that sustained hope throughout the darkest period of the war. One case that particularly affected Sarah involved a young Belgian nurse named Catherine who had been captured while helping downed Allied airmen escape through the Pyrenees to Spain. Catherine had endured months of imprisonment and torture before finally escaping, but, unlike Sarah, she had been unable to make it all the way to safety. She had been recaptured just kilometers from the Spanish border and spent additional months in German prisons before finally being liberated by advancing Allied forces. Catherine's story reminded Sarah of how fortunate she had been in several crucial moments during her own escape. The decision to trust Marie rather than continuing alone through the forest, the timing that had allowed her to avoid German patrols at key moments, the successful contact with the resistance network in Port-en-Bessin. Any one of these could have gone differently, with fatal results. Survival behind enemy lines requires skill and determination, Sarah told Catherine during one of their conversations. But it also requires enormous luck. We can prepare people as well as possible, but we can't control all the variables that determine whether someone lives or dies. This understanding influenced Sarah's approach to training. Rather than presenting survival as simply a matter of following correct procedures, she emphasized adaptability and decision-making under pressure. Plans will go wrong, she would tell her students. Equipment will fail, people will betray you, weather will turn bad at the worst possible moment. Your ability to improvise and adapt is more important than any specific technique. As 1944 progressed, and Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, Sarah's role expanded to include briefing personnel who would be parachuting into occupied territory to support resistance operations and gather intelligence. These men and women faced many of the same challenges Sarah had encountered, but they would have the advantage of training, proper equipment, and established support networks. Sarah's briefings focused on the human element of survival, how to read people quickly and accurately, how to maintain psychological resilience during extended periods of stress, and how to recognize when situations were becoming untenable and escape was necessary. She emphasized the importance of accepting help from strangers while maintaining appropriate security precautions. The people who helped me survive took enormous risks for someone they had never met, she would explain. There are good people in every occupied country who will help if they can. But there are also collaborators and informants who will betray you for money or out of fear. Learning to tell the difference quickly is a survival skill that can't be taught from books. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 marked a turning point both in the war and in Sarah's personal recovery. Watching the massive Allied forces cross the Channel toward the same French coast where she had made her desperate escape gave her a sense of completion and vindication. The resistance networks that had helped her survive were now playing crucial roles in supporting the Allied invasion, and the intelligence she and others had gathered was contributing to the success of operations that would eventually lead to the liberation of Europe. Sarah requested permission to return to France as part of the medical services supporting the invasion, but her request was denied due to her unique intelligence value and the importance of her training work. She watched from England as the Allied forces fought their way inland from the beaches, following their progress through the same regions where she had struggled to survive just months earlier. Reports began filtering back about the fate of resistance networks and individuals who had helped Allied personnel escape. Many had paid the ultimate price for their courage, executed by German forces as the occupation became increasingly desperate and brutal. But others had survived to see liberation, and some were able to play direct roles in supporting the Allied advance. Sarah learned that the church in Port-en-Bessin, where Father Antoine had hidden her, was now serving as a field hospital for wounded Allied soldiers. The irony was not lost on her. The building where she had first found help and hope was now providing the same sanctuary for other people fighting the same war. As Allied forces advanced deeper into France, Sarah received permission to visit newly liberated areas as part of intelligence teams documenting resistance operations and gathering information about German defensive strategies. Returning to French soil for the first time since her escape was emotionally overwhelming.